Hi everyone, my name is Maria Liapopoulou. I am the chair of the second Young Members Subcommittee, and thank you very much for joining our webinar on risk sensitivity to hazard model updates, insights from the European Seismic Hazard Model. This webinar will be delivered by Dr. Athanasios Gkimprixis from Renew Risk and Dr. Laurentiu Danciu from the Swiss Seismological Service at ETH Zurich. Before we begin, please let me go through some housekeeping rules. Please keep your video cameras off and your microphones on mute for the duration of the presentations. There will be time for questions after the end of the presentations, and if you have any question in the meantime, please feel free to type it in the chat. And also please note that the first part of this seminar is recorded and will be uploaded on our second YouTube channel. So by dialing into this event, you agree that any information or views you share will be made public. As I mentioned before, the seminar will be delivered by Dr. Athanasios Gkimprixis and Dr. Laurentiu Danciu. Athanasios is a senior risk scientist at Renew Risk. He specializes in risk modeling for renewable energy, and this builds on his previous experience as earthquake catastrophe model developer and seismic vulnerability expert at E.ON. During his PhD in Strathclyde University and as a visiting researcher at UCL, Athanasios studied the seismic risk assessment for improved structural design and insurance, and he holds 2 master's degrees in seismic design of structures and in civil structural engineering, both from the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. Laurentiu is a senior scientist at the Swiss Seismological Service of ETH Zurich, and he is also the General Secretary of the European Facilities for Earthquake Hazard and Risk. Laurentiu specializes in earthquake hazard and risk modeling and has led the development of various seismic hazard models across Europe and Middle East. Notably, he led the development of the 2020 European Seismic Hazard Model, which is now the reference model for the seismic hazard risk across Europe. So without further delay, I will now hand over to Athanasios. If you could share your screen to start the presentation.
Yeah. Oops. Yeah. Can you see now my screen and present?
Yes, perfect. We can see it.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Maria, for the invitation, first of all, and the introduction. Let me start by saying that, as Maria mentioned, I work for Renew Risk. However, because I've only recently joined the company, the topic that I selected to present today is part of my independent research based on a paper that I published last month. And this work is looking to provide answers to typical questions that arise when a new hazard model is released. The first question is how much the new hazard differs from the old one. And then the second question is, what does this hazard change mean? What does it imply to my current risk estimates? A third question, which I haven't addressed, and we have Laurentiu following my presentation to elaborate on, is where do these hazard changes derive from, and why at the end of the day we need to update our hazard models. This is the outline of my presentation. I will start with an introduction on the topic and motivation behind this work, and then I will address the 2 questions I mentioned regarding the hazard model and then the impact on the risk estimates. And I will conclude with a summary of the key takeaways. So to begin with, because we have different definitions of risk among the industry and the academia, here, in general, risk can be seen as a function of the hazard and the consequences. The hazard, when we are talking about earthquakes, is the expected shaking in terms of likelihood and severity. And then we can have damage arising from the shaking and also losses due to damage, particularly of interest for the insurance industry, the economic losses, which can be due to the damage to the structure itself, but also considering the contents loss and business interruption. On top of that, we can consider also the environmental impact, as well as human casualties in different levels. We can understand from this short definition that risk at its core is interdisciplinary, and this is reflected to the various metrics available to quantify risk, depending on who the stakeholders involved are, what interests they have, and what is their risk management strategy. And having said that, the most typical strategies that we have in order to manage risk is the mitigation and the transfer. Mitigation aims to reduce risk of existing structures by providing strengthening, and for new buildings by improving the seismic design standards. And then at the second level, when we have an earthquake and indeed we have some damage and associated losses, we have the transfer mechanism, which help us transfer part of the financial burden to an earthquake insurer, for example. But no matter what the risk management strategy is, it involves assumptions which bear inherently uncertainties, and these introduce variability to the hazard and risk estimates. And this can be understood by the frequent updates that we see in the regional and national models. Updates which typically are followed with a series of publications discussing on what has changed. I noticed that there are, however, limitations of existing work on this topic. For example, most of the studies are confined to only one component, looking at the hazard without discussing on the effects of the risk. Other studies that go a step further, however, they are confined to particular locations, looking, for example, only on a couple of sites. And other studies that go to a wider scale, however, they are looking only on one building type, one risk metric, and usually they focus on the 475 years, which is the typical return period used for seismic design of structures. Taking all this into consideration, last month I published this paper, which introduces a simplified holistic framework to understand the sensitivity of risk to hazard variability. I use the term holistic because this framework considers at the same time different hazard models across different locations and return periods. It can take into account different building typologies and definitions of risk, and at the end of the day, it can be adaptable to other perils, for example, with flood or wildfire. For this reason, the framework is simplified in the sense that it uses existing hazard data which are already prepared and are available openly. And this is the overview of the framework. In short, we start with some case studies in order to understand what has changed in the hazard, what is the existing hazard variability. Then we introduce an analytical risk assessment framework, and combining the two, eventually we can calculate the sensitivity of the risk to the hazard change. And the framework concludes with a simplified approach to prepare for future updates of the hazard model. Let's see now the first question, which I mentioned in the beginning: how much has the hazard model changed? For my case studies, I used the two versions of the European Seismic Hazard Model, the SHM20, which is the new version, and the SHM13, which is the previous one. And the data is openly available in this website developed by the European Facility for Earthquake Hazard and Risk. And one can access hazard maps for different return periods or hazard curves for a particular location. In this example, this hazard map shows the distribution of the peak ground acceleration for a fixed return period of 475 years. typical for the seismic design, and that corresponds roughly to a probability of exceedance of this ground motion, 10% in 50 years. Now, if I want to examine different return periods, I can also select one particular location and get the hazard curve, which shows the PGA for different return periods. And with this, we can understand that the main challenge when we want to compare two hazard models is that we have to do it across different locations and for different return periods. Let's start with the first part of the challenge. What we can do in step one is we can have the maps of the old model on the left next to the new model on the right and make some first visual comparisons, or also provide another map which shows the ratio of the two ground motion, the new PGA over the old one, and we see that with lighter colors we have locations of increased hazard, with darker colors areas where the hazard is decreased. Let me add here, clarify in case that someone is not very familiarized with GIS, that the actual data provided by the model are given in a grid of points. So this map is not just a picture, it's a digitized grid of points. And for each point, we have longitude, latitude, and information for the PGA. And therefore, for each point, I can do calculations. The next step, I can combine the two maps, in one common plot in order to make some conclusions more evident. And now each point in this plot describes one particular location, and the vertical axis gives the PGA, the horizontal, the ratio. The same for the SHM20, and then when I place them side by side, I can conclude on the hazard variability across these locations. We can see, for example, from SHM13 that areas of higher seismicity, say with PGA above 0.5 G, present ratios from 0.4 up to 1.5, meaning that in these areas, roughly, the hazard change is plus minus 50%, while we can see more significant decrease and increase in areas of low to moderate seismicity. For example, we can see in these locations here with low seismicity that the ratio exceeds 2. Now, these conclusions refer to the hazard variability for the return period of 475 years. And if I had this theoretical scenario where the old model was updated with a parallel translation, then my story would end up here. However, this is not the reality. I give an example here of one location. We see that the new model has been reduced, but with a non-uniform way across different periods. And we can even have examples like this, where the two hazard curves present a crossover with the ground motion for high return periods increasing and for lower decreasing. And this brings us to the second part of the challenge that I mentioned in the beginning, that when I compare two hazard models, I have to do it not only across the different locations, but also for different return periods to understand the change in the whole hazard curve. To perform this, I start with some direct comparisons of the models, old hazard versus the new one, for different return periods. And we can see, for example, if we look at this plot for 50 years, here we have the PGAs with the new model, and here the PGAs of the old version. With red line is the case where there's no hazard change, and I also fitted the yellow line in the data to better visualize the trend. The conclusion is that as I go to higher return periods, this cloud of points shifts upwards, which is something that we noticed also in this example previously. But what I still miss from these plots is that I cannot clearly understand in which cases I have this crossover. To better visualize this and make some conclusions more straightforward, I then make some normalization of the plots. And now, instead of PGAs, I compare the ratio of the PGA for 50 years versus the ratio of the PGA for one reference return period of interest, for example, the 475 years. So practically, I want to see what is happening across the hazard curve and how the point here differs with the point here, for example. I repeat this for different return periods. I only give here 2 examples. In short, what we see is what we mentioned before, that the update across different return periods is non-uniform. Otherwise, all the points would fall in this red line. I also noticed that, say, roughly from 500 years up to 1,000 years, the changes are minimal. And then for lower return periods, the points fall below the red line for roughly. And for high return periods, they are above. What is also interesting to notice is that we have points that fall outside the gray areas, like this region here, and these highlight potential locations of crossovers, because here, for example, we see that the PGA for 475 years has reduced by 20%, and the PGA for 5,000 years has doubled in this location. Going now to the second question that I mentioned, how all these influence my risk estimates. For this, I have to define an analytical risk assessment framework, having the hazard curve of my location, and then we need one curve that describes the performance of my building. For example, a fragility curve like this one, which shows the probability of collapse for different levels of the PGA. When I combine then the two, the seismicity of my location and the fragility of my structure, I can calculate one risk metric, which is a single value. In this case is the annual collapse risk. If I go now to a finance-based approach, for example, in the insurance industry that we are looking on losses, then we can describe the structural performance with a vulnerability curve, which shows the losses for different levels of the shaking. And combining this with the hazard of my location, I get now the expected annual losses, which is my risk metric. Here in this study, I use a broader term. I just use this nomenclature RM to refer to any risk metric that is derived by combining the information of the hazard with some log-normal distribution that describes my structure, no matter what this shows, if it is damage, losses, etc. And I give just one example. We can repeat this for different systems. For this particular system, we see that this plot here shows the risk metric obtained with a new hazard model, and here with the old one. And generally, we see a reduction of the risk with a new model. There are locations where the risk is increased. I've seen that this is in the vicinity of 0.3G. I give more details in the paper. I will not spend more time on this. What is more important is to evaluate the risk variability and how it compares to that of the hazard input. And for this particular system, in this example, we can see how the risk metric changes for different changes of the hazard, described by the ratio of the PGA for 475 years. The diagonal line here shows the case where the risk variability equals that of the hazard. And in general, we can conclude that the risk variability is higher than the hazard variability. For example, here we see that the hazard has increased 2 times, the risk, eventually the risk increases 5 times for this hazard change. However, we see that this is not the case in all locations, and even we can see extreme cases like this one here, where we see that the hazard has reduced by 20% and the risk, however, is increased almost 2 times. This is because we are kind of capturing the hazard change only by looking at the 475 years. And as I mentioned before, the hazard curve is not updated in a uniform way. If we had this theoretical scenario, which I mentioned before, the parallel translation of the curve, I repeated the calculations using this approach, and then I get this red cloud of points, which validates two comments I made before. First of all, that the risk variability is always higher than the hazard. And second, the deviation of this scatter of blue points from the ideal red behavior is because of the non-uniform update of the hazard. Next, as I was looking at this figure and also revisited the previous plots that I showed for the hazard, I noticed that the general trend resembles more than that of the lower return period hazard. And this shows practically that this particular system is more sensitive to these ground motions for the low return periods, and therefore any change in these ground motions will affect more the risk metrics. If I go to a different system with a median shifted on the right, then we see that the general trend resembles more that of the high return periods, because these ground motions contribute more in the calculation of the risk for this particular system. And the general conclusion and key takeaway from this is that when we want to examine the risk sensitivity to any hazard change, it's a twofold problem. We have to look at the hazard changes themselves, but also what are the properties of my structural system, and what, at the end of the day, what part of the ground motion contributes more in the convolution, in the calculations. And the last slide of this section, some considerations for future updates, taking into account the inevitable evolution of the ESHM20, as Laurentiu will discuss later. What I have done here is I take the ESHM20 model, which is the latest version, and across all locations, I multiply the hazard curves by a fixed ratio. And then I calculate the risk and I compare it with the current risk levels. Let's see an example. If we look here, for 1.5, this means that if in future we have 50% increase of hazard across all locations, then this is the distribution of the risk ratio. My risk will change from 2 up to 5 times. If we are interested only on the higher seismicity areas, these light blue points here, the hazard and the risk changes from 2 to 3 times roughly. And because I will also show you different systems, I also fitted a regression line in these points to make some visual comparisons more easy. What is another important point that I wanted to make is that the risk sensitivity is amplified with increasing hazard rather than decreasing. And what I mean is, for example, if we look here, these points refer to 20% hazard increase, and for this, the risk is max increased by 135%. For 20% reduction, it's decreased 65%. And as I said, I explored different systems, and the conclusion is that as we reduce the beta and we increase the median, so for less vulnerable system, the risk sensitivity is increased. That's all, and just a summary of the key takeaways of each section. We started with some investigations to understand the existing hazard variability, and we discussed about the challenges when we want to compare to hazard models, that we have to do it across different locations and different time periods. We focused on the 475 years PGA in the beginning, because this is what we typically use for the seismic design. For higher return periods, we notice plus minus 50% hazard change, and then for higher seismicity areas. And then for low and moderate seismicity areas, even higher increase and decrease. For the hazard curve in total, we discussed how we can use direct or normalized comparisons to understand the change of the slope and review where I have cases of crossovers. And in general, for return periods lower than 500 years, we see mainly reduction, and for return periods higher than 1,000 years, generally increase in the new model. Then we introduced an analytical risk assessment approach, and we calculated the risk metric sensitivity. As I mentioned, risk variability is always higher than that of the hazard. It's not easily clear when we are looking only on one return period, because in reality we have non-uniform update of the hazard, and this affects the risk metric sensitivity depending on what range of the PGA contributes more in the calculations. And at the end, we saw also a simplified approach to prepare for future updates of the model. The approach is simplified because we also want to cover all different locations and potential scenarios. And the main conclusion was that the risk sensitivity is amplified with increasing hazard and for less vulnerable systems. That's all for my part.
Great, thank you very much, Athanasios. I will now stop the recording.